I think it's more of a feeling, and it's more of to use like a DJ verb, a vibe. I think schools should be reflective of the communities that they're in, or the learning community that they're in. It's about the process, and that there's space for different ways for kids to go through that process and document their learning, and that they get time to explore it.
Education, learning, and technology have always had a complicated yet symbiotic relationship. On the one hand, we talk about innovation, how technologies and digital tools can transform learning, personalize instruction, and engage and connect students to a world of possibilities. But on the other hand, there's the reality of outdated policies, uneven access and implementation, and the ever-present challenge of ensuring technology actually serves learning rather than just appearing in classrooms as another shiny gadget. Few people understand this balancing act better than Julia Fallon. As the Executive Director of SETDA, the State Education Technology Directors Association, she works with education leaders across the U.S. to shape policies that make education a real force for equity and innovation. With over 3 decades in EdTech, Julia helped shape the U.S. Department of Education's 2024 National Education Technology Plan, and has spent 17 years at the Washington State Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, where she worked on everything from digital learning to IT policy. She holds a master's degree in education technology from Pepperdine University and a bachelor's degree in business education from New York University, both of which clearly set the foundation for her lifelong work at the intersection of education and technology. But as you'll hear in our conversation, Julia's interests don't stop at education. When she's not leading conversations on the future of EdTech, she's live streaming DJ sets on Twitch. Because as you'll hear, learning should always involve curiosity, creativity, and maybe even a great beat or two. In this episode, we talk about what makes an effective digital learning strategy, why equitable access to technology is still a challenge, and how classrooms can finally move past that 1950s factory model of education. We also explore what Canada can learn from the US approach to EdTech policy, why Julia believes all great classrooms and schools have a vibe, and of course, what DJing has taught her about learning. This is Education Matters. I'm Jason Bukhari, so let's dive into this fascinating conversation with Julia Fallon. Julia Fallon, welcome to the podcast. Where does this podcast find you?
It finds me in the South Sound in Seattle, in the Puget Sound area, and it is a lovely 27 degrees Fahrenheit here in the area. So I'm just south of Seattle, for those of you that really need to know on the map where I am.
Excellent. And for those that are not seeing us on YouTube or on the Spotify video feed, you have this amazing DJ setup behind you, which I hope we get to a little bit later.
Yes, this is not only my office; it's my makeshift studio. So if you notice, it's on wheels though, so it actually can move into my living room or my summer deck when we have some nice weather here.
When you throw the big EdTech
parties. When I throw the backyard parties.
Awesome. So I would have given you a proper intro at this stage, but can you give the audience an overview of who you are and what you're doing?
Sure. I am the executive director of a professional association called SETDA, which is the State EdTech Directors Association here in the United States. We primarily work with state education agency leaders, both the EdTech space and digital learning. Sometimes we lean a little IT as well. And what that means is there are actually 56 state education agencies that make up the United States. That includes U.S. territories and the Department of Defense schools. And we work on policy issues, practice issues. I often think of our association as the implementers and integrators of technology that you see at the state level. And they're really helping connect the dots between policy and then implementation, and obviously supporting their districts in their region and their states.
Well, I'm fascinated by the role that you play in particular, and SETA's role at large, because as you know, Canada does not have a federal body of education. And although we have some associations similar to SETDA, I don't think we really have anything that compares. And I kind of think it's a really amazing and necessary organization to help extend all the work of educators across the country. But before we dive into that and your work there a little bit more, can you give our audience a overview of where and when you grew up?
Where I grew up. So I grew up in Seattle, back in the day. I'm going to say, I don't want to put it like how old, but, we, lived in sleepy Seattle at the time until I was about 11. And then we moved to New York City. And if you can imagine the contrast of living in the Pacific Northwest and then moving to New York City, as an 11-year-old, it was a different world. The kids were the same age as me, but they were definitely older than me and more mature in some ways. And then I spent my teenage years and undergrad in New York City. And then when I had an opportunity to leave, I left. I think it felt like, for me, I realized then the pandemic really drove this home that I do not like large crowds of people. And I think New York for me was just like, if I don't get out now, I was about 24, 25. I'm never getting out. So I took an opportunity to actually move to Michigan, to Ann Arbor, Michigan. I worked for the University of Michigan and an organization called Merit Network back in the mid to late 90s. And then I ended up coming back to this area in 2000 for another job opportunity. And my family is here. So I got the best of both worlds, though. As a kid growing up, I got to be in New York, but spend my summers in the Pacific Northwest. And for those of you that are familiar with the Pacific Northwest in the summer, it's the best time of year to actually be here. And so I have that sort of dichotomy of, I come off as a New Yorker, I think, because developmentally I probably am a New Yorker. But my mom would often joke, you're a West Coast girl with an East Coast attitude. So that's sort of my background of, I love mountains and water, and I love where I live. And I don't think I can see myself living anywhere else.
That's fantastic. Just a quick aside. Did you miss the whole grunge era in Seattle?
Well, yes. Yeah. But I think, participated in a little bit of it. I mean, I think growing up in the Pacific Northwest, we definitely have our own flavor of fashion, even though it's not really fashion. And, you own some flannel shirts, you wear the beanies. I don't think that's ever stopped. I think the joke, though, is we don't wear socks. And I don't know where that comes from, at least in Western Washington state. Socks is not a thing in my shoes. So it's one of those things. So I did come back in the summers but grunge is grunge, and you have to like that type of music and everything else. So, while I loved some of it, I didn't love all of it. So I think it just depends. But also Seattle's known for jazz. I don't think people realize that Kenny G's from here. There's a big jazz scene. And I think jazz is my first love of music in that genre. Interesting.
So how did you play as a child? Maybe give me the West Coast version and then what you did in New York later on.
Sure. I'm very Gen X. So I think the Gen Xers out there will understand that we were kind of free range kids. You left your house with your bike and you rode around in the neighborhood. And again, when I was living here as a child in Seattle, it was really the sleepy Seattle. It wasn't as more of a metropolis that it is now, or a tech hub and whatnot. It was less populated. And I think about the house that I grew up in Seattle proper. And, there was maybe 4 cars parked on the block. And now I think you can't even park a car on the block. It's so jammed. But I grew up near an area called Green Lake. I remember going down there to go swimming in the lake, but also doing swimming lessons. I was one of those kids that was involved in lots of things. I appreciate my mother's efforts to expose me to music and to art. And I had ballet. I was a swimmer. I had my neighborhood friends and that sort of thing. I'm one of those kids that I loved the science center that we had, the Pacific Science Center in Seattle, which is still in existence. Even when I would come out in the summers to visit, there was always time that was spent at the science center. So I think there's always been a curiosity of how things work and just experimenting. And I think that's where it came. And the New York side, I think, just gave me more street smarts, how to take care of yourself, you know what I mean? How to speak up for yourself, how to cut through things.
Whereabouts in New York were you?
In Queens, New York. So I was in the smack dab of the city, and everything else. We were in I lived in Astoria, Queens, which was known at the time as a very Greek neighborhood. I think it's the largest concentrations of Greeks outside of Athens, is what I've been told. And I still have some great friendships from my high school experience there and everything else. I went to NYU at New York University as an undergrad. So I was still in the city. experiencing all of that. And I mean, I know you see the DJ decks behind me, and people are like, what kind of DJ are you? Definitely a house music DJ. And that was because of my experiences in New York and clubs at the time when it was coming into the scene in the late 80s, early 90s. Mm-hmm. So I got to see some of the firsthand music live, without phones, without all the stuff, without all the hype. So there was a great, I love my experience in New York. I don't know if I would ever live there again from the day to day. There's a stress of living in New York City, but I love what New York afforded me at the time, and just helped shape who I was.
Out of curiosity, when you were at NYU, did you ever cross paths with Neil Postman?
No, but I do know that he was on campus. So
yeah, he was there.
Yeah, I was in the school of, it's like the School of Education, Health, Nursing, and the Arts Professions. I have a business education degree. So, but I did work in the computer labs there. And that's where I first got my start in the space. And I think I was doing, in essence, I was doing EdTech before EdTech was the thing. We called it academic computing at the time, at least on that campus. And it was before, I mean, it was like pre-internet, pre-commercial internet, pre all the stuff. And we talk about that curiosity. I had to take, so to go back, I took 4 years of math and science in high school, like everybody does for college prep, but no one talked to me about engineering. It's still, again, they were talking to, I think, us about health careers, as a woman. Even though I think I was more leaning, I loved logic math in high school, but I still think I used it every day, the if then else kind of theorems that you would be doing. And it wasn't just thinking of like engineering. It was more like, oh, Julia, you're into I love baseball. So you were into baseball. Maybe you want to become a sports trainer. So I was like, okay, physical therapy. And then I ended up at NYU taking some classes. I'm like, nope, this is not what I want to do. This is, that pre-med bio course is not, doesn't inspire people to become, if that's not your thing. But I had to take, I think system analyst was the hot jobs. We looked up the hot jobs at the time, like what could you do to make a living? And instead of transferring to the business school, we figured out, a classmate and I figured out if we took all the courses in business ed, we were getting the same grounding as those that were doing system analyst work in the business school. So that's where I started off. And I had to take these 1 credit courses during the summer about how to use a word processor, a database, a spreadsheet. And at that time and now I'm going to date myself, it was WordPerfect, Lotus 123, and DB4. And I was kicking myself because the first summer semester, I typed on a word processor, an old school, looks like a typewriter thing, took me 3 days in the summer to type intro to marketing paper. And then I learned WordPerfect in the next session. And I was like, Jesus, I could have been at the beach for 2 days. I could have just made some edits and printed it out. And I think for me was like, why are you so resistant to the technology? And I just absorbed it so fast that professor that taught those 1 credit courses that we needed said, you need to come work for me in the computer lab. I'm like, you don't understand. I know nothing. Like, I am just fascinated by the fact that I can learn something here and it's going to make my life easier. And he says, oh, don't worry, I'll get you a job in the computer lab so you can help me on Fridays and be my assistant. So often I would be learning stuff aside in the class while he's teaching it and then helping people learn it as well. So, and that started the career. And I give a lot of credit to that professor for kind of pulling me across the line and seeing something that just ignited my love of learning. And again, I learn something new every day with technology. There's no shortage of learning stuff in this space. So, and that started me off, ended up managing a computer lab for NYU for a couple of years before I left and went to Michigan.
Yeah, I love these stories because I don't think human history is ever going to see the dawn of a technological age like we kind of went through. And so I love sharing with the audience these kind of stories. If I can ask you just to reflect a little further on what was that spark that made you love learning? What's the first thing you remember loving to learn?
I'm trying to think. I remember getting Legos as a kid from my grandmother. We got a lot of Legos. And maybe it's just the ability to modify things or pattern recognition. I don't know. I am trying to think where that curiosity came from. And maybe not being squashed for asking questions about how stuff worked, or I don't know. I had a third grade teacher who I'm still in touch with, believe it or not. We thank God for Facebook and other things. And I just had a third grade class reunion with some of my classmates here in Seattle. But what I loved about her is, I believe it was her, that we learned a different culture every month. So we would learn all of the curriculum through that culture, right? So if we were Japanese that month, we were learning, it was all through the lens of being Japanese, or Filipino one month. And I remember we were Austrian another month, like we were just learning culture and history and gardening or whatever it was. And I think it was just that there was a whole world outside of everything. And I don't know where it came from. And I don't think my parents were squashing me asking questions maybe either, or letting me, I remember being a voracious reader. We used the library a lot. I read a lot of books when I was younger. So I don't know if it was that too. I don't know where it came from. I'm always curious. I'm always asking questions, but I think it's also like logic mapping. It's like, how does it fit in? How does it connect? And I think it's more of that. I look at things as systems, and how it impacts each other, because nothing is in a vacuum.
So speaking of systems, you've been all over the US for sure, probably in also various parts of the world. I know we were discussing before we hopped on here about your experiences in Canada as well. What are some of the most inspiring things you've seen in education?
Inspiring things that I've seen. I think it's that we are trying to change what learning looks like. So we're up against this kind of narrative, this 1950s classroom, which people seem to idealize, right? This golden age of maybe the United States, or, everybody's in their party dresses, dancing, like the very 1950s, when, the US was definitely on top of the world, in terms of space exploration and, upward mobility. There's very fond memories of this. I understand it because my parents are of that generation, right? Like that's where they grew up. But I think as we get farther and farther, those my child, right, who's a teenager, doesn't know what that really looks like, aside from maybe, from a fashion kind of thing, or maybe some music and whatnot. And I think the innovative things that I'm seeing is that, when I go into a school building and everybody's sitting in rows and it's quiet, not that I'm suspicious, but it's almost like, what is happening here? Because it doesn't mimic our lives that are so interconnected with one another. Like I want to hear noise, and I want to see groups of kids working together. And the idea of, learning theory in action, you know what I mean? When we think of constructivist learning theory, or, Vygotsky and his zone of proximal development, like video games kind of lend themselves to that, right? You're stretching goals. Like I'm trying to think of those kind of innovative things where people are trying to take that and make it part of the community, the learning community, and be very intentional about the design of that learning space and the design of the learning experiences, and making students feel empowered and having agency over their own learning versus I'm just going to dump all this stuff. And that makes me think directly of a keynote that I saw at NEC. Now it's ISTE, but it was NEC back in the day in 2006. It was David Weinberger, who's one of the authors of the Clue Train Manifesto, that talks about, I grew up, and I don't know if you grew up, Jason, with the encyclopedia salesman, coming around and trying to sell you a set of encyclopedias, and like, oh, wow, could we get one? And maybe you just bought the book P, you just got the P book, but somebody made a decision about what went in that book. Whereas on the internet, right, you can learn about, and David talks about this in that keynote, you can learn about deep fried Mars bars. If that's your thing, there's a Wikipedia page, or there's a Usenet news group, or there's something else, and you can deep dive into that if that's your passion or that's your thing. And no one's gatekeeping that. And it's more back to that early Greek where you'd have the marketplace and somebody on a box orating to everybody their ideas, and it's more of a communities thing. So for me, it's like trying to move folks back to that, and schools and leaders in those schools that try to foster that. And, immediately who comes to mind is like folks like Chris Lehman at the Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia, where you walk into that school and there's this energy and this vibe, and the kids are like, they want to be there, right? Like you don't feel that resistance of like, I have to be here. Like they want to be there. That's the energy that you get. So I think for me, that innovative is moving to that and trying not to fall into that 1950s. We're just going to dump stuff in your head and you need to know 50 state capitals or you need to know cursive or whatever it is.
Yeah. And let's come back to maybe how we move the collective, public education school project forward so they can, so more classrooms look like that. But can you kind of help define or describe what those classrooms that inspire you look like?
It's funny. I had this, someone asked me this in another podcast and I'm like, I know what my vision looks like, but I want to be mindful that other people might have different ideas of what that is. So not to say that this is a subscribe thing, like we need to replicate this all over.
The other people, they can say what they want.
I know. But for me is, I think it's more of a feeling and it's more of to use like a DJ verb, a vibe, and everything else. And community really gets to decide what that means for them, right? I think schools should be reflective of the communities that they're in or the learning community that they're in. So when it comes to color on walls and furniture, that's not where I am, but I do feel like there's this energy of, and space, right? People are making space for those side quests, right? So let's say you're working on something and a kid has a question and there's space for the kid to go down a different path, maybe to explore something that's related to what you're talking about, right? Or I think about the Universal Design for Learning framework, right? I always say if a student can create a dance, choreographs a dance that explains how DNA binds, that's just as valid, right? And can demonstrate its learning just as valid as some kid that's really good at PowerPoint and throws together, or a video and throws that together. So I think for me, it's that classroom looks like it's not about the end product, it's about the process, and that there's space for different ways for kids to go through that process and document their learning, and that they get time to explore it and they get time to noodle on it. And that we're all not lockstep. I don't see kids of the same age necessarily doing that. It could be a mix of kids. And I think that we need to make things a little bit more relevant for kids as well. You know what I mean? And it could be they're learning about history in a video game, or they're learning about it through a community-based project. I think for me, it's more of connecting the learning to them and making it relevant for them, and being mindful about it, being really intentional about the design and the space for a community to come together and learn together.
Well, I love that answer, in particular the way you started, because the first one to, I think, very accurately describe what a lot of people have identified, and it's a vibe. These really amazing classrooms have a vibe to them that is not always easy to explain. So I really like that. This might be a good spot to move over to your work at SETDA, because the next set of questions I want to ask you are around how we continue to build public education and see these classrooms with a vibe more often. So can you maybe start with some of the work at SETDA and the role you play in advocating for, that kind of vibe learning?
So some background about my experience with SETDA. So this is SETDA's about 23 years old this year. I think it might be 24. We're going on our 24th year. I've been actually part of this organization for 21 years, only 4 years as staff in this role as executive director. But prior to that, I was actually a state member representing Washington State for 17 and a half years. So when I joined our education agency here in the state, I became a member of SETDA and part of our SETDA team of folks that came out of our SEA. What I love to talk about SETDA and still how I view it, and I think this is sort of how I look at our community, is that we are a professional learning community. We're a small and thriving one. When you have only a few people in every single SEA across the country, sometimes you don't have those peers to talk about, or you're in a unique role where you're connecting dots. Like, how does technology support your agency's learning goals or your agency's just operational goals? And it's nice to talk to other people in different parts of the country and saying, oh, you're working on that too. what do you know? What do I know? And then you can kind of riff on it together. So for me, it's always been sort of a leadership development and professional learning community where we get to hone our skills about becoming leaders and also leverage the network, right? We leverage our professional network in all cases. So the things that we're really working on now is, again, like I said, we're trying to figure out between the policy that gets made at the federal and state levels, then how do you implement that? How do you implement it so that it becomes a program that then goes off to support your school districts or your educators or your administrators? And can you borrow from other states? Can you get ideas? Can you try something new? But what we are really focused on, EdTech is that space where, and I always describe it as, it's the technology for learning. And we have the boxes and wires side, the IT side, right? That you just need to have foundationally, secure network, applications that work, all of that good stuff. And then you have the instructional side, which is the teachers and educators on, what learning strategies lend themselves, or what kind of learning experiences can I create using technology to bring learning to life, right? To help people be able to express their ideas and their thoughts, and how do they become communicators and collaborators and, content creators. So it's been this interesting thing of where I've talked a lot about cybersecurity, because again, if you don't have a secure and safe space, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have the greatest teacher using all the stuff, you just put people at risk, right? You want to have safe experiences for kids, especially since they're still developing and everything else. They're not adults. There's a whole other characteristic to our sector, in essence, that, the minors outnumber the adults. So we talk a lot about cybersecurity just because that's top of mind, right? There's a lot of risk that's happening there, both in protecting students' data, but also just protecting students and keeping things safe and secure. Generative AI, of course, hit the scene a couple of years ago. I talk a lot about AI and emerging technologies. And while we're acknowledging that AI definitely will have a bigger impact than other emerging technologies in the space, we are still going through the things that we always hold dear in our heads. Is it safe? Is it secure? Is it accessible? Is it interoperable? We're going through the checklist, the logic model that we've had in our heads for years about whether or not it makes sense to have it in our space, right? Any type of emerging technology. And it's not just our sector that's feeling it, right? It's all the sectors. So having those kind of conversations. We have conversations around, and I always joke around that sometimes it's not very sexy to everybody else, but it seems to be a sexy topic to us. But systemic changes, what can we do from a systemic standpoint that can help change the system? So we talk about things like procurement. Not everybody's going to be a tech expert when they're going through a procurement process or they're a procurement officer, but how can we help them ask the right questions so that when we are putting things out to bid, or when someone is offering services and products to our space, that they are addressing the things that we hold dear. Again, going back to those sort of 5 quality indicators that we've been working on. So that's sort of the IT side of the house, right? Getting devices, making sure that there's universal access, and not just, we used to just focus really on schools, the state of school IT, what the campus connections were like. But the pandemic showed us that, and again, we live in a modern society. Kids get devices at school and they go back and forth. And if they don't have high quality internet access at home, then how are they going to do their homework, collaborate with their classmates, communicate with their teachers, do research? So we're now focusing on what community access looks like. Wherever they are roaming around, do they have access to be able to connect back to their school community and have those, again, those learning experiences, right? Because that's what we do in the world. I mean, I often joke around, like if we took away your computers, nobody would get any work done. So it's the same sort of thing for kids. They need to have those experiences. And regardless of career pathway, we talk about workforce development a lot. I'm not just talking about the jobs of tomorrow and the robot jobs that are out there. I'm talking about nurses and farmers and small business entrepreneurs and people running their own businesses and auto mechanics, all of it. You know what I mean? Everybody uses computers and they need some sort of form of digital literacy. And how do we embed that into everything that we're doing? So that's sort of the IT boxes and wire side, going a little bit instruction. And then on the instructional side is how do we make sure that teachers are getting those skills, right? And there's one thing to be a user of technology, is another thing to be an integrator of technology. So how do you help teachers understand what instructional strategies lend themselves best? How do they assess both digital literacy skills and their own content area that they're in? Because again, we're not expecting all teachers to be IT people, but we're expecting them to have some level. And I think what we've been pushing upon, and I don't mean to disparage teachers in any form or fashion, so I hope this doesn't come across like that, but we are now in 2025. No, teachers don't really have the luxury of not using technology, right? Like they used to be like, I'm going to close my door. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. Yes, you should have some flexibility and some agency over what you're doing with your students because you know your students best. But in order for them to be successful, once they leave our systems, they need to have experiences. And if you choose not to use it, you are almost disadvantaging them. And I'm talking about inequities in a building. Forget about the school district across the river in a, you know what I mean? That's in another neighborhood. I'm talking about in the same building. And if my kid's last name starts with an F and some other kid starts with an M, and by the algorithm, just by alphabetical alone, they're in biology 101, Mrs. Smith, he doesn't use technology as a student with an F last name. And the M student gets to use Mrs. Smith with with technology. There's already disparity there in terms of equity and maybe being able to be successful once they leave our system. So we're trying to figure out how we help teachers get those skills, either through pre-service, their post-secondary careers as they become teachers. Like, how do we help them see that for themselves and still give them the flexibility and autonomy as a teacher? And again, how does technology help free up them to be more of a teacher, be more human, and those human things that we're known for, right? Which is the power of what AI is offering us. But we still want it to be a safe and secure and, a positive experience for folks.
Can you help me understand very tactically how your organization does this? Like you said, build community and professional development. It's almost like, that's a microcosm of what each district really tries to do and tries to focus on. But you're not only not working with several districts or states, you're doing it with all of them. So tactically, like, what do you do to help on those two fronts, on building the community side and the professional learning side?
We, because we're not all in the same physical space, I can't call together everybody. We do it once a year, though. We have an annual gathering. So our conference looks a little different than other conferences because it's really more of a summit. It's more of our community coming together and spending time together. And because we're small, there's an intimacy to our events, right? We're never more than probably 300 people. And then we get to spend a couple of days together and we kind of get to dig in and learn from one another, right? There's opportunities for that. We maintain a Slack space now. It used to be more of a discussion board, but we've moved to Slack. And that allows for more real-time questions. And as you can imagine, you and I are talking here in February at the very beginning of legislative session, both at the federal and state levels. And there's lots happening in 2025. And we have, a channel that's all around policy and legislation chat. So we've done some stuff where it's a topic specific so that people can kind of go in. So those of you that are familiar with like Discords and everything else, it's sort of set up the same way. But the idea is that you can create spaces for folks to do topic-based discussions. And then we have sort of a nomenclature for, what is formal to informal. We offer an informal times for people to come there. We have something called Wednesday Water Cooler, which actually was started during the pandemic for people just to kind of show up and there's no agenda and you can talk about the weather. You can talk about whatever's top of mind. And we have some regulars in there and we have other people that show up on those days. We kind of offer different things for people to kind of engage. We have a Monday newsletter goes out. I often say that we try to be very, again, intentional curators of time and attention. I don't want to waste anybody's time. So the idea is using, again, design and being intentional about stuff, about this is what's going out here. We have a pretty successful open rate for that newsletter because people know that it's probably pertinent to what they're doing and it's noteworthy stuff, things that are happening in our space. Perhaps there's a committee meeting or another calendar event that's happening. But that's how we, and we share legislative updates, of course, like this, this happened this week, or this is happening. There might be a hearing that people want to are interested in, but it gives them enough so that they also can share it with folks within their own agencies or even with their school districts that they're serving, so that they're empowered. They don't need to know everything, but they have a source. And the idea is to try to be really good at knowing what they need and what they want so that we can kind of deliver on that. So in essence, it's running, again, maybe that perfect kind of scenario, but we do it virtually. You know what I mean? People can congregate around ideas or meet up. We do socials at other people's conferences because we know our members are there, and it gives another chance for networking. Sometimes they just want to spend time together and trying to figure out how you do that to build those relationships. And then I'll give you an example. When generative AI hit in August of 2023, you know, a lot of people are like, what's going on with states? Why don't states have policy? And I'm like, well, states are not designed to come right out. They're not reactive in that sense. They are very measured. It takes them, you know, it'll take them a little bit to make sure that they're not, how it fits in their bigger system of laws and regulations. And if you think about a state education agency, they're really compliance. They tend to be more compliance focused than other kind of spaces. And they wanted to make sure they're going to get it somewhat right. And we had a bunch of states that kind of came together and came out first. So I always joke around that the West Coast came out first. We had California and Oregon and Washington. What we did is we asked those members that are ours to say, could you come in and just kind of do a roundtable and talk about the good, bad, the ugly? Because a lot of ledge sessions are now starting in January. What could they be asking their legislatures for if they're going to dictate that we're going to have to do this? And one of the things is like, you need to ask for a task force. Make sure that your legislature or your state agency is going to put together a task force to help you develop the policy stuff. And they learn from each other, right? The folks that go ahead, just because that seems to be either a governor or a state superintendent's priority, they then will share back, you know what I mean? And they kind of leverage all that. Everybody's working on different things. So it's always been like that. I mean, it's been like that even since when there's always a way to kind of connect and say, hey, is anybody doing this? Who's doing that? Oh, Kentucky has a great example. Maybe we can borrow from that.
Yeah.
And just sharing those types of things so that you can, you know, it's like many hands make easy work or whatever it is. But they love the collaboration aspect of it. And then we create resources on behalf of our members. So, for example, we just released our Universal Connectivity Imperative report in January. This is around the digital divide. We hadn't done one since 2019. I know that when I first came in as staff, they're like, when are you going to do this thing? We were in the middle of the pandemic. I'm like, well, we're still like trying to deal with that. But also we kind of want to see where things settle post pandemic, right? That shined a big light on the fact that we didn't have enough devices and access. And when it happened, we actually joked around as a community saying, we told you so. We've been working on this for 20 years. We already knew that there was gaps. So we just put that universal connectivity report out. But now our members can use that not only at the federal level, then when their state agencies are maybe advocating for it from the federal government, or we can go up on the Hill and advocate for it, you know, through Congress, but also they can advocate it for it in their state legislatures. And there's that joke around, you're never a prophet in your own land. And while you might be the one saying it, now we have a report that comes out from an organization like mine that will then, you know, let them have some more research behind it and some recommendations and from the policy space in order to move that needle forward. So it's a community leveraging their resources and, again, creating that space for them to build those relationships.
Well, this is really why I wanted to talk to you. I mean, I think despite the differences in our systems and the complexities of both the Canadian and American systems, you work at this really important intersection, right, between policy, the school districts, and then one side we haven't talked too much about is the EdTech side or the tech side. Can you describe how you also work with those group of folks and how you help support their work? So
the EdTech side, well, of course, like at state agencies, they're running around on both sides, right? They're typically sometimes underneath their chief information officers, but also, which is the IT shops, or they're on the academic programmatic side, right? They're in federal programs or they're in spaces, but we have corporate members as well. So those corporate members that are part of our community not only are thinking about how obviously they can work with states and doing all that sort of things, there's almost a want to be in that federal and national conversation around all those priority areas, right? So wherever they intersect. So I don't want to call it, you know, social collective, but in essence, we find the companies that join us have a bigger mission than just getting their products and services into the hands of states and school districts. They want to make the system better, right? That's sort of this altruistic kind of collective thing. And what we love about having those corporate members in the space is we also get to influence their own product offerings and making sure that, again, the things that we hold dear are built into their product lines, right? So, or their services, and they're thinking about that, or thinking about how it impacts the bigger system than just, you know what I mean, making sure that shareholders are getting their value or their ROI on their products and services. So it's being part and being able to influence. And sometimes companies also need us to be able to speak on their behalf as well, right? It comes a lot stronger when we're all in it together. And so we very much value our corporate members in that space that choose to kind of go on this journey with us. Again, we're small. We're small by design. We don't let everybody in. We also want it to be a right fit. And if we don't feel like it's a right fit for either one of us, we basically, you know, it's no harm, no foul there. But we definitely want people in our space that share our values from the state member perspective. Those are our primary members. But yeah. And then we have something we call affiliate members. So while it may not be a state education agency, it could still be an organization that serves a region or a state. And they also they're a little bit closer to the districts sometimes than states are. I mean, I think there's this idea that states were just in everybody's, you know, backyards and in the districts. And sometimes that's not the case, right? We kind of know generally what's going on, and we know maybe a handful or more than a handful of districts that are doing great work, but we don't know everything, right? We also come in and we looked at as compliance people. So sometimes they don't always want to share what they're doing, especially if it's something that's not in compliance, that might be innovative, you know, like there's this kind of tension that happens, but our affiliates are able to kind of help us see those types of roles that they play. And they often will supplement, you know what I mean? Or supplement services for those districts that maybe are under-resourced, and then they are working with states. So it's a nice little mix of folks doing the work, in essence, you know, moving the needles.
So what recommendations would you give to EdTech founders, whether they be startup or early stage or kind of mid-sized companies? Because I think a lot of people get into the EdTech space, I don't want to say for the wrong reasons, but I think they think it's going to be easier than it actually is, in the sense that they see, you know, steady budgets. They know that there is a procurement process in place. The dollars are spent. But I don't think from the outside, folks understand how complicated the mission is. Do you have any recommendations for how to navigate the space and how to go about, you know, really spending your time creating some really innovative products and services that the system does need?
I think they need to really understand the sector. First and foremost, like when you think about cybersecurity, I often joke, you know, the best practice in cybersecurity, one of the best strategies is two-factor authentication. We know that, right? Like having that. But now try it with a 5-year-old that's in kindergarten. And that's a unique characteristic of our sector. It's different than working in healthcare or in manufacturing or a hospital service or even higher ed, right? You really need to understand our sector, or at least have a good understanding of what the market and the sector looks like. And that includes, we often, you know, the business sort of model is you offer volume discounts, right? If you can land at a large district, you're going to get a discount because you can give me more seat licenses or you can do whatever. But we have small districts where you don't have a whole town that's going to get 9,000 kids overnight and be able to take advantage of that volume discount. So from a pricing model, you might want to look at how you price things different for smaller districts. Here in Washington State, I believe it's a third of our districts, and then 60% of those districts are under 200 kids total, right? And those communities are not getting an influx of people moving from the big city into their spaces to give them more head count and to be able to take advantage of volume discounting. So is there a way that you can maybe offer a different pricing model for them and then maybe market it differently? If a district has 32 kids, instead of saying you only have 32 kids that are using your license, you have 1 out of 295 school districts. Like there's a different way to look at it versus this volume idea. It might be more work on your part. But there's ways to kind of either leverage those smaller districts, and maybe from a regional standpoint, you could offer something, but really looking at the sector, but you need to have things that are like, that you need to make part of your values too, right? Things like, again, security, privacy, safety is big. Our kids, are you compromising kids' data? Interoperability, accessibility is big. Can every student, how are you addressing the needs so all students can use this product, or you're being very upfront about what students can use the product, so you're not selling them something that they don't do. I want to create more people that are not in the ed tech space. Like, I know that we already go through this logic model. When I'm walking an ISTE floor, I'm walking a COSIN floor, I'm already having those questions in my head. But how do I help the people that are not ed techers ask those questions and elevate the thing? I don't want to see, you take the superintendent out for a steak dinner and then they get a $2 million contract because they fell to a good marketing pitch. I want you to show that you're engaged maybe in logic model development with the school district, a needs assessment, research. Even if you're not going to do like heavy research about your product, you should be engaging in some evidence stuff. Like, where does it work best? What conditions? So that you are helping schools with the limited resources they have make good decisions. And that's part of your give back, right, to the space, and everything else. There's lots of great ideas out there, but if you're going in it just to be able to sell a company off after 5 minutes, that doesn't help the system as a whole. That's my personal opinion. I will say that. I won't say that, but mine, I don't want to see that. I don't, you know what I mean? These are human beings. They're not widgets. And I want to make sure that we're not negatively impacting those spaces.
If I can ask you to look into your crystal ball and look at education, let's say 50 years out, and you can describe the good, the bad, the ugly, what does it look like to you?
Oh, that's a good question. I am hoping there's more flexibility in the space, whether it's class schedules or classrooms or how kids show up at school, whether it's online or it's in person. The good is, I think people realize, and this came to me very crystal clear during the pandemic. No one missed the Bell schedule or Chem Lab during the pandemic. They missed rituals and they missed their communities. They wanted that human connection. So if we capitalize on that's what's best about our spaces, how do we then make that a learning, how do we make it so the kids want to show up, right? That's why they're coming to school, is because they want that human connection. They want to be able to connect and learn. I mean, having conversations, whether it's written word or speaking word or through video creation or whatever, is learning, right? Where you're learning. You're either having that conversation in your head with that author offline or asynchronously, or you can have synchronously stuff. So that's the good, I think. I think we're still going to have those spaces for learning to happen. As humans, school doesn't have the lock on learning anyway. We learn from the minute, we start off in this space. And how do we just maximize it so that kids can sort of find what gets them excited, and then maybe they can do that for the rest of their lives, sort of thing. The bad is, I'm trying to think. I mean, I personally in the United States though, and I don't know about Canada because I haven't spent a lot of time in the system in Canada, but like it's really a political space and it's so politically charged right now. And I don't know, it's always been political, right? Like it always reflects the values of a community. The best place to get started in a political career is the school board. Like it's all of those things. But it's become some polarized so much that, I mean, it's just a battle of the values maybe happening right now. I'm hoping that it gets tamped down just a little bit, or like you find some common ground. I think everybody wants what's best for their kids and their community at whole. Can you find a space where that's possible, that everybody can see themselves in that community?
Yeah, this is one of the things that I go back and forth on is your organization is proof of what good you can do when you're navigating a federal system with a bunch of state partners, right? Here, we don't have a federal system. So that kind of integration, I think, just doesn't happen. However, I do think that Canadian education is less polarized or less political because of it, because it's not a federal political football every time there's elections. It does kind of stay down into the provinces, and obviously is political in the provinces, but not in the same way. So that's one of the things that, we've always gone back and forth. Should we have a federal program, and then it by nature becomes more political? And then I think you identify the project quite well. It's to find common values, to find many things that we can agree upon as to how we want to educate future generations of people. I think there's a lot of things that most people, when you really strip it down, agree upon. So can I maybe ask you to reflect on those values in a different way? My penultimate question is, if you had a magic wand, and I do remind you, it's all powerful, what would you do to change the U.S. education system?
What would I do to change the U.S. education system? And I'm going to make the disclaimer that this is Julia speaking and not necessarily SETDA speaking. I like bureaucracy and I don't like bureaucracy, if that makes any sense. Because I think sometimes it can insulate from too much change, right? Because, as humans, we like our comfort spots, but I wish we could sort of agree or come to consensus on what the purpose of school is. And it could be multi-purpose. I think there's folks that think it should be X and it should be Y. For me, I think I go back to that sort of Jeffersonian model of, in order to have an informed citizenry, you have to have an educated citizenry, right? And it still can be reflective of your community. I don't think that that doesn't mean that everybody has to think the same way. Does it make sense? It's just that you can come and you can make arguments and you can have discourse and you can do it in a way that's still respectful and everything else. I think it's just evolved to this, name calling and bullying and, fear.
And polls that want people to think the same way. I think you actually nailed it. The purpose of it is to get people to think differently, but with a common kind of poll or a common vision. And I mean, this is really at the heart. I hate to say this, especially with a lot of Americans listening to it, is that I've had to re-educate a lot of Americans to their own history. Like, this is a very American thing, to have a system that is about bringing people together and, despite all odds, coming together and growing and bringing in perspectives and preserving the views of the few against the tyranny of the many. So I think that's a great answer.
Yeah. So I think that's maybe the magic wand, is just to, and what that looks like in every community, and to not necessarily think it has to be a cookie cutter. I think there's got to be some models for flexibility and how they get there. So allow for that sort of innovative stuff. We have to create safe spaces for people to fail too, as long as they're learning from it, right? So that's what we want. Nobody gets the right answer all around. And I know we haven't really talked about the DJing. Part of the reason why I started streaming on Twitch and everything else was to learn out loud. You don't become a Diplo or a Tiesto overnight. You just don't. Like, you start somewhere. And I thought, if I do this out in front in public, which is not my normal nature, for those of you that know me very well, they know that this is not what Julia does. She likes to be in the back looking at everybody and observing, doesn't want to be up front. But if I'm doing that and I'm messing up, then I've created a space for me to say, hey, I'm learning out loud and I'm a learner here. And maybe it wouldn't be so scary and it wouldn't be so punitive, like, oh, well, she should have known how to do that, right? If I come off and just say, hey, I'm learning and this is a learning lab and I'm getting better. I mean, I look at, 3.5 years of, starting off and to now I've grown. Now, granted, the learning might be a little less, incremental. Like, at the very beginning, it was like strides, like I was making all these strides, but now I'm pushing myself to the next level. And what does that look like? And I still have the person that taught me how to mix, give me quests, including this past weekend when I was live streaming, like, oh, you should try to do this. And I'm like, all right. You know what I mean? And in some ways I'm role modeling, like, you're going to learn on the fly. Now, granted, I wouldn't be probably doing that during a paid gig at a festival if I ever end up at that level, but,
never know.
You never know. But I created a space, right? To get a quest, in essence, on the fly. And I created my own learning space.
Well, that's certainly another of the themes emerging from the podcast, is everybody I'm interviewing understands the importance of letting humans fail to learn. It's just built into our learning software essentially. So I appreciate that. With
Well,
that,
and doing it in a way that there's not like you lose your house or you lose an arm or someone dies, right? Like, I think that's the beauty of like video games is you can try and try and try, and then it puts you back to where you were. So you can try it again.
I mean, that's how school should be too, right? Like a safe, like, okay, you don't get this math concept. Keep going. You didn't do well on this engineering project. Do it again. Let's do another one without the, I had, I guess just recently, Avery Rube talk about like this cliff of failure. Like maybe sometimes in an essay, you want a student to try something very, very outrageous to learn the bounds of the English language, of the essay format. And they won't ever do that because the difference between a 50 and an 80 when applying to university is too big, right?
Right. And that's a whole conversation about assessment, which I am not an expert in at all, but we have this assessment system that rewards perfection versus the process. And what's interesting to me that one of the first when generative, again, AI hit the scene, everybody was talking about academic integrity and people are cheating. And I'm like, well, it's probably going to be the same kids that are cheating anyway. So that's, for me, that's not a thing. But if you did not focus so much on the end product and you had a student show what queries they were asking, what road they went down, they can kind of document the learning process. To me, that's what you want to assess, whether or not, who cares? Yes, you can spit out a report that gives you XYZ, right? According to the standard, but you want to see how that kid gets there. And they may get there a way that you might not even thought of, but they may still get there, right? So the end product isn't what gets graded. It's the process. Like, did you, and that's this kind of skills we need humans to have as we move into this kind of modern age, right? I feel like our system is just not modernized at all. Can you write a good query? Can you, when you get information, can you assess it to make sure that it's actually good stuff? Like if something can spit out, Google can spit out the state capitals in 2.53 seconds, do I need to memorize all of them? No, I probably need to be able to assess though, whether or not it's giving me the right state capitals.
And then we can ask the question, is there value to memorization, period? Right? So if the answer to that is yes, then we still want our kids to memorize the states, but the purpose of it is different. Yeah. Right. It's not to know all your states because you can get that, search it readily, but you want to strengthen your memory because it's helpful in navigating life. Right.
But there's some foundational stuff that we definitely need. I think about like DJing. I need to know how to beat match. If I don't know how to beat match by ear, it doesn't matter. The technology could do it all for me, but that's the foundational skill. And later on, you can then rely on other things to do. So there's we need to decide what is considered foundational. And for me, memorizing 50 state capitals is not foundational. It's more like,
but writing and reading,
yes,
probably are, right?
And basic arithmetic, calculations and stuff of math. Yeah.
Excellent. With that, the last question is always a book, podcast, movie, album, any or all of the above to recommend to the audience.
So I'm going to go fun here and everything else. So I'm going to recommend, so those of you that are maybe runners or you're out running around and you need like some BPM, like some energy and whatnot.
Which I do. Yes, I love this already.
I primarily mix a genre called tech house. So for those of you that are familiar with it, if you're not familiar, it's techno and house music. If they had a baby, this would be the genre of music that I play. So whatnot. But there is on SoundCloud, which is hopefully anybody can access. I didn't want to give you an Apple Music or Spotify because maybe not everybody has subscriptions to those services. But my most favorite DJ duo is a couple of guys out of England called Gorgon City. And they have a 3-hour set that was done in November of this past year in Melbourne. And it's just one of these high energy, shake your butt kind of sets. And it's called the Revolver Upstairs. It's a place in Melbourne. And if you can check it out, I will make sure Jason gets the link and everything else. But it's one of my favorite sets this past year. I actually got to see them 6 times last year. I'm a little bit of a fanatic there.
You go deep.
I went deep. They're like my soul music and everything else, but they're a fun thing. And the BPMs are probably about 126, 128, 130. And everything else. Awesome. But that was my running BPM was 126 back in the day. So I was always listening for music that had that kind of around that BPM.
wonderful way to wrap up the podcast with some high beats per minute recommendations. Julia Fallon, thank you kindly for your time.
Thank you.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bukhari. Until next time.